Hello, everyone. Today we got chapter 18. We're going to talk about the brain and the cranial nerves. This is a big chapter. It's a little more in depth. It's a little long. There's a lot of information. I would suggest if you have, I know you're watching this video, if you have obviously your notes out, but maybe your book on the side as well, so you can kind of walk through the book as well. I have my book right here on my iPad on the side, and then I have my paper notes on the side because it's a lot of info. I got 15 pages of information. So feel free to pause it whenever you want. So we're going to dive into the brain, the cranial nerves. So first we'll go into the brain, kind of the structures, a little bit of the function of each structure. We're not going to get too in depth. Remember, this is anatomy, so it's the structure of the brain. But we do need to know a little bit of kind of what's going on in those structures. When you get to physiology, then you start getting a little more connecting the dots and understanding the why of many things and the how of all those things. We'll get a little bit into the structure. So let's do this. Okay. The brain. The brain, the center for the emotions, behavior, for memory, just all our intelligence, right? But each section of the brain has a specific function, and that's what makes it so unique and so interesting, but yet so sensitive. Every single area of the brain has its own specific function. So when you damage one area, you are damaging one specific function of your body. So that's why it's so important to understand the different areas. Just a little brief intro. I did my master's in biology, and I did my thesis in traumatic brain injuries, so concussions basically, and uh, and this is kind of like an area where I'm kind of interested in, and it's I did a 95-page thesis to present my presentation and a 95-page thesis to finish my master's, which is pretty cool and super interesting, but a lot of information, and it can get confusing at times. So I'm gonna try to help you out through it, and again, have notes out and have maybe your what's it called, your book on the side. Okay, so we'll start a little bit with kind of brain development. To kind of The brain and the spinal cord will develop through that what's called the neural tube, and then it's divided into, like, you have these primary brain vesicles, secondary brain vesicles, and then the adult structures that you are seeing once the brain develops into an adult. So here's a good little image going through and going around. So we have the three main brain vesicles or regions: the prosencephalon, mesencephalon, and rhombencephalon. So it's like, those are big words, but it's pretty much kind of where most of the parts are gonna arise from or develop from. So now that I'm having a little baby girl on the way, this is kind of interesting for me. So my wife's week 26, so this is so already a little over this. But basically, the prosencephalon will produce kind of the cerebral hemisphere, like the diencephalon and the cerebrum, kind of that goes all around. Um, let's see if I can go through each one specifically. So the prosencephalon develop into the anterior telencephalon, which is cerebrum and lateral ventricles. The mesencephalon will be the midbrain and kind of the aqueduct of the midbrain. And then the rhombencephalon will have the pons, the cerebellum, and the fourth ventricle. So kind of that little blue area. And we also have the medulla oblongata over here, and then the spinal cord is the last one that's coming out. So just kind of what regions they kind of develop into. Then the adult brain. So we're gonna get into the adult brain. So major parts of the adult brain. We have a brain stem, right? So the brain stem is like continuous to our spinal cord. So we got into the spinal cord. So we're on top now. So we have a little brain stem that kind of branches from the spinal cord and connects it to the brain. We have the cerebellum, the diencephalon, and the cerebrum that's on top. So those are kind of like the four main parts. Okay. Let me go through my book because I don't want to skip anything. My lights are turning off. Anyways, I don't think it's too dark, so we'll be okay. Okay. So yeah. Now talking about the brainstem, the cerebellum, and kind of the diencephalon, we have specific. Oh, and the cerebrum. We have now specific brain structures in within those main parts of the brain. So if you see here, so it's diencephalon is kind of like bolded, and then underneath that you have your thalamus, your hypothalamus, your pineal gland. So those are parts of the diencephalon. You think of the brain stem, and then you think about the midbrain parts, and you think about your pons and the medulla oblongata. Okay, here on the back you have your cerebellum, and then on the top you're gonna have your whole cerebrum, kind of through the top. Okay. Now our brain is very, 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 very delicate. So remember how we talked in the spinal cord where you have the bones kind of surrounding the nerves in the inside, or like the main structure. So that's why we have our brain, but it's surrounding and by a couple of protective layers. So we have our cranium, kind of like the skull, cranial meninges. We have what's called the cerebrospinal fluid, so fluid that goes into kind of the brain and the spine. And then we have what's called a blood-brain barrier, and those are super important. All of those are super important, but they're the ones that protect our brain from any injuries or from anything, any nutrients or anything that wants to get, or bacteria that wants to get into our brain, because it's our main control center. Like it's the main one. So the brain and the heart. So okay. So we have what are called the cranial meninges, and we'll look at a couple of pictures right now. But basically, we have dura mater, which has the falx cerebri, the falx cerebelli, and the tentorium cerebelli. And then we have the arachnoid matter, and then we have the PM matter. Right, so it's kind of the same layers as the spinal cord. So here we have in a couple pictures, you can see different layers. You can see here's our bone on the top, our cranium. Here's a parietal bone, our skin, obviously. And then we have our dura mater. That one has 2 layers, so it's pretty much like 2 thinner layers. And then we have our arachnoid, and then we have our PM mater, more on the inside. Okay. So the subarachnoid space, right, kind of in between those two, would be in that area. Arachnoid granulations, kind of the little cells here for the arachnoid layer. Here's another picture as well. The dura mater, the falx cerebri, over here in the area. Tentorium cerebelli over here. Straight sinus in the back. Transverse sinus. Falx cerebelli, down on the occipital region. Here's our little sphenoid point. But yeah, again, the bottom right, here's our 3 little layers: parietal, dura mater, in the parietal bone, sorry, and we have our dura, arachnoid, and PM matters. Kind of more from my real dissection. So hopefully, you get to see some of these cool structures on the brain dissection next week. Okay, then we have, so after all areas, we have our cerebrospinal fluid. So cerebrospinal fluid, clear, colorless liquid that protects the brain and the spinal cord against any chemical injuries and physical injuries. Okay, the cerebrospinal fluid is made in the ventricles. So you have your lateral ventricle, you have what's called the septum pellucidum, which you'll see kind of right now in a little bit. You have your 3rd ventricle, your 4th ventricle, and you have what's called the choroid plexus. So now think about your brain and think about like when your hands, just think about your hands. And when I have sweaty hands, so to me, like when I played baseball and everything, that little sweat helps me pick up papers, and go through the papers. So it's like kind of like helpful in those areas, but I mean it is kind of annoying. But just think about the brain. Think if it had no liquid, and the brain would be kind of rubbing off each other, and it would be rubbing off the cranium as well. So it kind of gives it a little more of a better movement throughout. So in case there is some sort of impact on the head, that little liquid or fluid that's in there will kind of prevent like direct scratching kind of contact in between the different parts of the brain. So it's also kind of where we send a lot of information through that cerebrospinal fluid. But to me, I just think about that little liquid as a protective layer in case there are other injuries. So we have the lateral ventricles, right? So you can see here's our lateral ventricles. Here's our 3rd ventricle. Here's our aqueduct. So kind of the area, or kind of like a tube area where it's gonna flow through to the midbrain. Here's our 4th ventricle on the bottom, lateral aperture, obviously on the side, and the median aperture on the bottom, right? And here's our central canal going to the spinal cord. So basically in those ventricles is where you're going to see where you're going to see the production of that cerebrospinal fluid. So it's kind of like in between. You see that the little gaps, right? So right here they look blue. You think it's a structure. It's not a structure. It's kind of like a little gap or an area where you have all this fluid kind of inside. Okay, and this little picture on the right is pretty cool. It kind of shows the movement of kind of the filtration of the blood to the cerebrospinal fluid in that ventricle. Okay? It's kind of flowing through the blood coming in. Blood nutrients are components. So that's our little CSF. See, where am I at? Right now I think we're page 646 in our notes. So here's our little kind of movement through the cerebrospinal fluid. Turn on the slide. There it is. Sorry. It's like sensor, so if I'm not moving then it turns off. But, okay, where were we? Okay. Okay, so the three main functions of our little CSF or cerebrospinal fluid, we have mechanical protection, chemical protection, and circulation. So circulation is exchanging nutrients, waste between the blood and kind of the nervous tissue around it, right? So it's kind of going to be like our little, kind of like our freeways in the brain of all those nutrients. So if everything's made of structure, you need nutrients to flow through some liquid. So that's our cerebrospinal fluid. So if you follow kind of the arrows, the choroid plexus, so the little areas where blood's going to flow through, and the CSF is formed. So you can follow kind of an arrow of the CSF flowing through, right? Flowing through kind of the midbrain area. Here's our lateral aperture, remember? Then our fourth ventricle right underneath, and then our central canal coming to the spinal cord. It could also flow through and come around our third ventricle and kind of make its way around the cerebrum, kind of flow through, get all the waste, get all the nutrients, whatever our brain needs, all the way across and coming around. So it's kind of like a little pathway of how it's going to flow. It's pretty cool. Okay, and here they kind of put it into like a chart. Again, so you got kind of like the blood, arterial blood to the fourth ventricle, choroid plexus, so the blood flows through the plexus. It will go into the cerebrospinal fluid, into the fourth ventricle of the CSF, third ventricle, lateral, subarachnoid, right? So it's kind of through the so between ventricles, foramina, through the aqueduct of that midbrain, kind of in the middle. Okay. And so since it took all those nutrients, right, our arteries away from the heart, veins is to the heart. So that venous blood that was kind of filtered throughout as well will go into the heart and the lungs to get filtered again, because we need some oxygen coming to our brain. Okay, so, like I said, mechanical, chemical, and circulation. So those are the main functions of the cerebrospinal fluid. Okay. Now we have our brain blood flow, and it's called the blood-brain barrier. It's a cool acronym, huh? It's big names, but the blood-brain barrier. Okay. So the blood-brain barrier is kind of the blood into the brain, but it's kind of like a barrier. It doesn't let everything come in. So it's a good barrier. Imagine if every single thing that we got into our body came into our brain. That'd be pretty bad. So it allows oxygen, obviously, and glucose to flow into the brain, but it also protects us from harmful substances or chemicals that shouldn't go there, and pathogens. There's some medications that can't go to the brain. Proteins and antibiotics cannot cross the blood-brain barrier, so that's good. Then we have oxygen, carbon dioxide, some anesthetic drugs, and alcohols that are able to get into or through that blood-brain barrier. Man, I'm struggling to say those words. Okay, so clinical connection. So there's a lot of parts of clinical connection. Man, I don't like this. It's gonna get annoying, huh? I'll probably do it like 30 times throughout the video. I'll just stay in the dark. So there's gonna be cool parts of clinical connection. To me, those are the most interesting ones because those are the most relatable to kind of our areas, right? For what you're gonna work as, or what your job is gonna be later on, or the classes you're gonna take later on. So by looking at those clinical connections, you learn a little more about your job if you're gonna be a nurse or whatever you're gonna be, and it makes you apply everything you're learning from the notes into that like real life examples, right? So if we think about blood flowing to the brain or through the brain, if we also have some clogging of those arteries or those blood vessels, then the blood is not going to get into the brain, and that's when we get these strokes. So the ischemic stroke, ischemic. I don't know. So that stroke, the one on the left, has like a blockage of the blood that it can't flow through. So we block the blood going into the brain. We don't have the oxygen we need, and everything kind of like shuts down, and that's when people get a stroke. But then the other type of stroke, we also have hemorrhagic stroke, where you have a hemorrhage, right? There's a rupture in one of those vessels, so there's less blood flowing through. Um, so it's also pretty dangerous, right? Um, so it's a cool connection to what we're learning. Okay, whew. I feel like I did a lot already. It's been like 3 slides. All right. So, I was thinking right now, you see in the bottom right, it says like 20. There's some that I took off that I kind of changed around, but we're getting up to 90. So we'll get there. But okay, the brainstem and reticular formation. So we are on page, let me see where I'm at now. Brainstem and reticular formation. 18.3, page 640, 650. Okay, 649, 650, 18.3. So the brainstem has 3 main structures. You have your medulla oblongata, the pons, and the midbrain. So remember, our 4 major parts would be our brainstem, cerebellum, diencephalon, right, and our cerebrum. So we're gonna get into those 4 parts, and now the parts inside those parts. So the brainstem consists of the medulla oblongata, the pons, and the midbrain, and each one of those has its own function, and we'll get into each one. So medulla oblongata, it extends from the foramen magnum to the inferior border of the pons. There's white and gray matter. There are these pyramids that are there, and there are what's called decussation of those pyramids. So kind of the crossing from left to right. Crossing of information from left to right, which is why people say your left part of your body is controlled by the right part of your brain. So we'll see that in the picture right now. Okay, so here we are. Here's our medulla oblongata right here, like on the bottom, kind of like, I feel like they look like knees. Like someone's like sitting down, like the brain sitting down, and those are the brain's knees. Anyways, the medulla oblongata, you have the pons a little bit higher. Then we have our midbrain. Okay, and then these pyramids. So you're gonna see the pyramids, kind of like the crossing of those in there. So here's another picture of the medulla oblongata. So here's our decussation. See how that little crossing over occurs? It's kind of like chromosomes, huh? If you remember biology, get into chromosomes and crossing over and meiosis. So we got the decussation of pyramids. We have the pyramids up here. We have the different types of nerves. So that's a big one. As we go throughout, at the end, we're going to go over all the nerves, but try to see which nerves are associated with which parts of the brain or where they are attached to. So we can see here with the vagus nerve, which is number 10, the hypoglossal, number 12. All right, as we get to other parts, here's our spinal nerve over here on the bottom. We're going to see more nerves attached to different areas. So here's our 4th ventricle, which is where our CSF is kind of flowing through. Okay. Whew. Let me see. I don't want to miss anything on this side. Okay. Where am I at? Feel free to take a little break and pause it whenever you like. Okay, cool. Found me. Right, so we talk about the medulla. We have what's called the nuclei. So pretty much those are like little masses of some gray matter where a lot of body functions are going to be controlled in those nuclei. Okay, and those nuclei, you have the cardiovascular center, the medullary respiratory area. So just by seeing the words, just by looking at those words, what areas do you think those are the ones that are going to control, right? If you think about cardiovascular center, obviously our heart, medullary respiratory area, right? Control our breathing. You have what's called the olive, Um, then we have the gracial nucleus, cunate nucleus, and the medial lemniscus. Okay, um, the medial lemniscus is kind of where you kind of relay information from medulla to the thalamus on the other side. The gracial and cunates are going to receive sensory information and send it through the medial lemniscus coming through. The olive will send the information into the cerebellum. Okay, and in the medulla oblongata, so this is a big area. Write those down. The cranial nerves attached to the medulla oblongata, we have 8, 9, 10, 11, and 12. Okay, the vestibulocochlear, the glossopharyngeal, the vagus, the accessory nerves, and the hypoglossal nerves. Okay, the accessory nerves, we're just talking about the cranial portion because there's other ones that are not part of the cranial portion. Okay, so here it is. The midbrain and the reticular activating system. Okay. Reticular activating system. Let's go through these pictures. This is on page. I got too many papers. I'm gonna throw these papers out. You know, once we use them, get out of here. I wish I could give you guys all my notes, but then if I give you all my notes, then you wouldn't take notes. So, so I have to keep you in check. Okay. So now we got into the midbrain, right? And the reticular activating system. So let's look at the structure kind of. The cunates, the gracial kind of information gets sent or received, sensory information. There's immediate eminence. We have what's called the tectum. Okay. That's like the posterior, the top part of the midbrain. And we have what's called superior colliculi, and inferior colliculi. Okay. So they're kind of like reflex centers for the brain. Okay. And for kind of like visual activities. And here's our cerebropenduncle on the right as well. Cerebropenduncle. Okay. So here's also our little tectum. So that's like the top part, or posterior part of the midbrain, kind of midbrain area. Little red nucleus. What else do we have? Trying to check my notes. Trying to check my book. Trying to explain many structures if we can. Substantia nigra. So these like large pigmented pigmented nuclei kind of coming around. So when we release dopamine, so it's kind of the area where our dopamine will release through. And then we have our red nuclei or red nucleus, and those are red because they're oxygen rich. So they got a lot of oxygen in those areas, right? Blood's flowing through the brain or to the brain. What else do we have? I'm not missing any picture. Okay, so that's kind of our midbrain. I don't want to miss any parts, but the cerebropenduncles are kind of tracks where information is kind of going to go through as well. Motor neurons, nerve impulses from the cerebrum to that spinal cord, to the medulla, the pons that's underneath as well. So yeah. Okay. Then we have the pons. So we have our little pons, which has pontine nuclei. So again, nuclei, kind of masses of matter that have a certain function. So we have pontine nuclei. Then we have the pontine respiratory group. And the nuclei of 4 pairs of those cranial nerves, which would be 5, 6, 7, and 8. Trigeminal, abducens, facial, and vestibulocochlear nerves. Okay. There's no picture of the pons. I thought I had a picture of the pons. Let's see if there's a good one over here. If we can see. Here's our little ponds, kind of in this area. Is there a picture of the ponds over here? Not really. Man, more to the side. Okay, so we can talk about it, and then we'll get into the picture and kind of explain it a little more. But here's our ponds. So here's our burn, and the nerves are kind of attached to it. Then we have that midbrain, which has those cerebral peduncles, the tectum, which has two superior colliculi and two inferior colliculi, the substantia nigra, the red nuclei, oxygen rich. The nuclei have two pairs of those cranial nerves, which are 3 and 4, oculomotor and trochlear. Oculomotor will kind of be like the eyes. And then we have kind of like an area that's called the reticular formation. So it's kind of gray matter interspersed, so kind of dispersed in there among small bundles of the white matter. So that's where you have some ascending and descending functions coming up and going out. And then you have what's called the reticular activating system. Okay, that's the ascending portion, right, of ascending or sensory portion of the reticular formation. So here we can see the pons, right? So it makes sense that it's close to kind of the eyes, so it has like visual nerve, right? The nerve for the eyes, the oculomotor. Right, so here's our pons, the reticular formation, kind of reticular activating system, right? These are projections, so getting information from those areas. The reticular activating system. Many sensory stimuli can activate that portion of the reticular activating system. So we have the auditory stimuli, so hearing, the mental activities, stimuli from pain, touch, pressure, and receptors in our limbs and head that keep us aware of where our body is. So we can turn those on. Receive information and kind of send that information to whatever parts are going to control those areas. Okay, then we have our cerebellum. Our cerebellum. That words, I think that's gonna be my favorite word because I'm thinking of naming my daughter Isabella. I say Isabella, so cerebellum sounds kind of. Anyways, sorry, trying to give you a pause from all this thinking of the brain. Okay, it is the second largest part of our brain. Okay, we have what's called the transverse cerebral fissure. Okay, between the cerebrum and the cerebellum. We have tentorium cerebelli, we have the vermis, cerebellar hemispheres, anterior and posterior lobes, and the flocculonodular lobe. Okay. Then we also have what's called the cerebellar cortex, which contains a folia, arbor vitae, cerebellar nuclei, and then we have our cerebellar peduncles as well, inferior, middle, and superior. So I think I have a lot of those pictures. Yeah. Okay. Let's see. Whew. Okay. Okay, so we have what's called the anterior lobe. Getting like smaller every time. Anterior lobe, posterior lobe. Here we have our vermis as well. So basically, anterior lobe will kind of control or is concerned or kind of its job is to see the subconscious movements of the skeletal muscles here in the anterior lobe of the cerebellum. Then we take the posterior lobe. That's more with also subconscious movements of skeletal muscles, and then the flocculonodular lobe. Man, these words are a little hard. So that will give us a little bit of balance. Okay, so cerebellum will be in charge a little bit of that balance that we get in our body, equilibrium and balance. Between those two hemispheres, we have a little extension called the falx cerebelli. Is it in here? I think it's in here. Is it in here? Cerebral cortex, falx cerebelli. I don't think it's in there. But yeah. What else do we have here? We have the cerebellar peduncles that are there. So we think about inferior, carry sensory info from the vestibular apparatus to the inner ear. through the body into the cerebellum. We think of the middle one, impulses for voluntary movements. So voluntary movements will get into the pons. And then the superior one, so extend from the cerebellum to the red nuclei of that midbrain and to the thalamus. Okay, let's see. So here's another picture as well: cerebropenduncle or peduncle, little pineal gland. Arbor vitae. Here's a little cerebellum or folia, cerebellar cortex. Let's see. Okay, so if you think of like a clinical connection, I don't know if it's here, maybe I took it off, but a clinical connection to the cerebellum. So if you think of the areas it controls, what do you think will be affected if that area is damaged? Okay, and one of the examples I give you in the book is called ataxia, inability to coordinate muscle movements, right? Because we think of the peduncles, the anterior lobe, posterior lobe, subconscious movements of those skeletal muscles. So then inability to coordinate muscle movement, that's called ataxia. Okay. So like if you think of blindfolded people with that disease or that disorder, they can't touch the tip of their nose. They really can't control those muscle movements are there. Okay, diencephalon, page 657. Okay, so we have the diencephalon, which will give us, if you go back to our notes from the front, the thalamus, the hypothalamus, the epithalamus, right? My notes were all over the place now, and the cerebrum. Okay, so we had our brainstem, medulla, pons, midbrain, and then we had our cerebellum, like a little mini brain, cerebellum, a little mini brain, and now we're getting our diencephalon, which has thalamus, hypothalamus, epithalamus, right, and our cerebrum that's on top, the outside. So the diencephalon, just the thalamus. So now let's talk about the thalamus. Okay, it's pretty cool, pretty interesting. It has 7 major groups of those nuclei to get information: the anterior nucleus, medial nuclei, lateral group, ventral group, intralaminar, periventricular nucleus, and the reticular nucleus of the prethalamus. Okay, this has interthalamic adhesion and then an internal capsule. So interthalamic adhesion is basically a bridge of those gray matters that we have. It joins both sides or both halves of that thalamus in there. What else? Okay. So here is our picture. It's a lot, right? So our thalamus is kind of superior to that midbrain, a little bit on top of that midbrain. About 3 centimeters long, 80% of the diencephalon. What do we have? Major relay station for sensory impulses. Okay, transmitted mainly to the primary sensory area in the cerebral cortex and from the spinal cord, brainstem, and the midbrain. Perception of pain, temperature, proprioception, pressure, motor functions by transmitting info from the cerebellum, right, and the corpus striatum to the primary motor area in the cerebral cortex. Regulates autonomic activities, consciousness, our thalamus. What else? So then we have the major groups, 7 major groups on each side of the thalamus. Okay, so we have kind of like the 2 sections. We have the anterior nucleus, which is here on the top. We have the medial nuclei, the lateral group, lateral dorsal, lateral posterior, pulvinar, back on the side. The ventral group. You have the interlaminar nuclei, periventricular nucleus, and the reticular nucleus or the prethalamus. So kind of the structure. So we're not going to focus exactly on what each one does. It's a lot of work. It's a lot of information. So we're just kind of looking at the different areas of it. It's pretty nice and colorful. But we look at the inside So that's our cerebrum, but we got the thalamus. That's on the inside. It looks like an egg. Okay, like that little egg in there. So medial in the middle, anterior, obviously posterior, pulvinar here in purple. Lateral, geniculate, ventral, posterior, ventral, lateral, ventral, anterior. It's kind of different sections of the thalamus. Whew. Okay, the hypothalamus. So major functions: control the autonomic nervous system, produce hormones, regulate emotional and behavioral patterns, regulate eating and drinking. I gotta get that fixed because I eat a lot. I don't drink, but I eat a lot. Control of body temperature, and regulate our circadian rhythm and our state of consciousness. Let's see, we are on page 658. Okay. Major regions: the posterior hypothalamic area, the intermediate hypothalamic area, anterior hypothalamic area, and the preoptic area. So here's a cool little picture. Okay. Here's our paraventricular nucleus, lateral preoptic nucleus, right? Kind of before the eyes, I guess we would say. Preoptic. Anterior periventricular hypothalamus, supraoptic nucleus here on the bottom, suprachiasmatic nucleus on the bottom, arcuate nucleus, ventromedial, mammillary nucleus of the body, and posterior hypothalamic nucleus. Okay. We also have from diencephalon, we have the epithalamus and circumventricular organs, and then our cerebrum. So I think it doesn't talk much about the circumventricular organs. What else do we have? So yeah, kind of jumps that. Okay, we'll get into the cerebrum, and that's a big one too. That's kind of like all over the top of the brain, like the main part of the brain that you typically see. Okay, your cerebrum. So it has cerebral hemisphere, so kind of it's divided into sections. It has a cerebral cortex, a gyri. It has some fissures, sulci, and the corpus callosum. Okay, then it has lobes in that cerebrum, so it's by lobes: frontal, parietal, temporal, and occipital lobes. So kind of like our bones, and the insula. So here is our cerebrum, our frontal lobe, right in front, parietal, occipital, and temporal, kind of on the side that we have, and the insula is kind of like in between or in the middle of all of those. Okay, so here's our little insula to kind of they cut out a little bit of the temporal to show you the insula, frontal, cerebellum is on top, parietal, occipital, and temporal here on the side. Pons, medulla, and spinal cord, we see. Okay. Let's see. Where we at now? Dang, I got a mess. Okay, organization of the fibers into white matter. So kind of you see like all these little lines and kind of organizing how the movement's going to go through. So we have what's called, let me see if I think it has that yet. So we have what's called the association tracts, which are here kind of in the middle, top in the middle. And they have axons that conduct nerve impulses between cerebral gyri and in that same hemisphere. We have commissural tracts, over here. Cerebral gyri in one cerebral hemisphere to the same gyri in the other cerebral hemisphere. We have three main groups of those that send that info: the corpus callosum, anterior commissure, and posterior commissure. So you can see them here: corpus callosum, anterior commissure, and posterior commissure. Okay. Okay. Now, we have between deep in those each of those cerebral hemispheres, we have the corpus striatum. Okay. It's like a striated shape appearance of that inside capsule that you see. Um, you have globus pallidus, putamen, and caudate nucleus in here. So, caudate nucleus, kind of like the end of the caudate nucleus, this kind of bluish one. Putamen is kind of like in the middle, the head of the caudate nucleus, right? Your thalamus here in the back. All right. What else do we have? So superior view, arsenal septum pellucidum kind of in the middle. The insula, you can see him. So we're looking at kind of like the surrounding areas, right? It's our cerebrum, um, corpus striatum, corpus pallidus, putamen, caudate nucleus. Kind of in those sections. You can barely see it. It's pretty cool, huh? We'll see a cool brain next week. Okay, kind of that area or the accumulation of kind of the matter in those areas leads to a lot of the common disorders that we see. Parkinson's, Huntington's, Tourette syndrome, schizophrenia, OCD. It's all kind of in that area um, of that corpus striatum. So kind of that's like the main area where a lot of things are going to happen, and also if you're gonna, as we're gonna see later on, like through concussions, these kind of areas of kind of shorten up a little bit, so it's less control, less information in a sense. Okay, right. So then we have our limbic system, limbic. So it's kind of like this structure, kind of like on the inside of the cerebrum. Like you have your cerebrum, and it's kind of like on the inside you have a little limbic system. Okay, on top of that little diencephalon, um, upper part of the brainstem and the corpus callosum. Okay, so the main things of that, it's a limbic lobe, which has parahippocampal gyrus, hippocampus, and cingulate gyrus. The hippocampus. You have dentate gyrus, the amygdala, the septal nuclei, the mammillary bodies of the hypothalamus, the anterior nucleus, and the medial nucleuses of the thalamus, the olfactory bulbs, the fornix, stria terminalis, stria medullaris, medial forebrain bundle, and mammillothalamic tract. Whew, that is a lot. That's a lot of things in that limbic system, but here's a picture of it. Maybe make it easier. I kind of have the different sections of it. Again, you don't need to know right now exactly what each one of those does. Save that for physiology so you can learn a little more, but at least know kind of the structures of different areas, right? So we have our cerebrum. So we said it was like under the cerebrum. Here's our corpus callosum. So it's kind of like on top of it or underneath it, right? The cingulate gyrus, mammillothalamic tract, anterior nucleus, mammillary body, the dentate gyrus, the hippocampus, stria terminalis, stria medullaris, the fornix. So different areas of the body. So like I said, this is a topic that I did. And here's the crazy thing about concussions. Maybe it's something you're interested in. Maybe you've had a concussion before. But basically, the brain starts to look smaller. So there's a lot of research as to why that happens. There's many things. It's a couple articles that I read during my research. They say there's this accumulation of these proteins that are basically eating up those areas of the brain. So if you think at an age, I don't know, think of a teenager, right? So on your left, you have a very healthy teenager brain, but on your right, you have another teenager that had a lot of concussions throughout his young life. And the brain looks like a 70, 80, 90-year-old when it's supposed to look like a normal brain. And that's when, if you think of the structures of the brain and their specific functions, if you have less of certain areas, obviously those are the areas that you're going to be struggling with if you have CTE. So that's why it's so important to understand what CTE is, and kind of spread the word to like athletes and anyone that practices sports, or just anyone that had an injury or a concussion or something like that. Like this is literally how the brain's, and there's no way to look at this until the person's actually dead. So so it's like, oh yeah, he has CTE because I looked at his brain. They can't look at your brain right now, open it up, and oh, I think it looks good. Let's close it up again, right? So there's no cure or anything like that. Once it's gone, and you see big differences. Kind of here, like in the middle, you see big differences kind of top in the connection between the two. It's just it's a lot of it's a big difference. So having not having those areas affects how you control your body. Okay. Whew. Okay. So that's again those getting those clinical connections give me like a little boost. Like, oh, this is pretty cool. All right. So the cerebral cortex. So we talked about kind of different areas. Now we're gonna get into sensory areas. Right? We have the primary somatosensory cortex, primary visual cortex, auditory cortex, gustatory, olfactory cortex, and then we have motor areas. We have the primary motor cortex, premotor cortex, Broca's areas, frontal eye. So if you think of sensory areas, areas where you sense, areas where you grab stimulus or stimuli to send it to your brain. If you think of motor, you think of your brain sending information to your body. Okay, so think about that: sensory and motor. Okay, sensory is coming to the brain, motor is going away from the brain, kind of. Okay, and another clinical connection could be cerebral palsy in those motor areas, right? Broca's areas, frontal eyelid, premotor cortex, um, kind of those different areas. And then you have association areas. Okay. Um, so association areas are a little more complex than just send information one way or another. Um, they're a little more complex. They get into memory, they get into emotions, reasoning, judgment, personality traits, intelligence. So it's a lot more than just do this or here's what happened. So we have different areas. Somatosensory area. So I can give you. I have a couple of like kind of what they each do, but so somatosensory area determines shapes and textures of objects using touch. Prefrontal cortex. Um, Personality, intellect, complex learning activities. We have the visual association area, that is visual recognition. We have the facial recognition area, so understand or recognize people. Auditory area, obviously recognition of certain sounds. Orbital frontal cortex, identify odors. Um, Common integrative area, integrates sensory information from thoughts and transmits signals to other parts. Wernicke's area, that's speech, that's kind of talking. Okay. And I think I went to all of them just in a different order. So yeah. So I think our book has kind of what each one does. It does a little bit. It talks a little bit about each one, kind of what it does and stuff. So it's pretty cool. And there's a good little table, 18.2, and it separates the four main parts. It is on page 670. Separates the four main parts into other specific into smaller parts, and then into their functions of those smaller parts. So that's a good table to have, 18.2. Okay. So here we have our different areas. So as you can see, it's pretty much, obviously our brain is not colorful, but we just identify those areas to do those kind of functions or those jobs. Okay. And it's not super specific. It's not like this is one part and you can just take that out. They're kind of all connected to each other. Okay. So primary visual cortex, visual association area, Wernicke's area, kind of in the middle. So this is kind of in the occipital lobe in the back of our head, right? So the back of our head, people get hit in the back of their head, they kind of miss or have issues with their vision. In the front, we have the orbital frontal cortex, so that's more of odors, all right? It's closer to our nose. Auditory association area, which is close to what? To the ears, primary auditory cortex. Think of frontal eyelid field, that's also getting close to the frontal lobe. The Broca's area, it's also close to the front. So it's just ways of recognizing kind of where they are on your brain. In the middle, we have the primary motor cortex, little central sulcus in between, and then the primary somatosensory cortex as well. kind of in the middle going closer to the back. Common integrative area. So kind of a lot of information happens or occurs and goes through. Okay. Inside, so if you kind of open that up a little more, then you have, here's a little insula, and you have the gustatory and olfactory cortex, kind of like tasting, smelling. Okay. Again, clinical connection, traumatic brain injury. So my biggest thing during my thesis was, okay, this person he just got hit pretty bad, lost consciousness. My biggest thing was, where did he get hit? Because that area that was damaged the most is going to tell us what areas that person needs to improve on before we let him play again. Right? Doesn't make sense? So like understanding kind of the side or the area or the impact will give us a better idea as to what we should expect to be wrong with that person or to be kind of struggling with, because that part of the brain is the one that got injured. So pretty much I created my own set of tests that I can get these athletes through that will assess different areas of the brain. And then by assessing different areas of the brain, we're going to see either more mistakes or less mistakes. And that will give us a better determination as to if the person, of the athlete, is ready to go play again or not, if it's healed or not. Because if it hasn't, we're just going to keep getting hits and hits and keep shrinking that brain. So anyways, that's more of a little personal connection to all of that. Whew, okay. So we have functional organization of the cerebral cortex. So we have what's called hemispheric lateralization. Okay. So the cerebral hemispheres are almost symmetrical, but have a couple of those anatomical and functional differences. So that asymmetry is called hemispheric lateralization. Okay. The left, so we have the left cerebral hemisphere and the right cerebral hemisphere. We're talking about memory and a little bit about brain waves. Okay. I think we got into nerves already. But let me get you a little bit of info. There's no pictures through there, but if you're on the page 671, there's a little table there, 18.3, and it kind of splits the two hemispheres, right? The right hemisphere and the left hemisphere, and kind of different things. So that's why I say people that are left-handed are more on these type of attributes. People that are right-handed have more of these attributes, right? So think of right hemisphere, left-handed, left hemisphere, right-handed. So yeah, I'm right-handed, but I gotta go to my left hemisphere functions, reasoning, numerical, scientific. So yeah, I'm pretty good at all that. I'm not good at music and art and things like that. Kind of, actually, not that bad, but anyways. To think about memory as well, so kind of information acquired and through our learning is stored and retrieved, right? That's our memory. Without our memory, we just keep making mistakes. Some people have no memory because they do the same thing over and over and over again, expecting different results. Anyways, what else? So association areas that are involved with memory: the frontal, parietal, occipital, and temporal lobes, parts of the limbic system, the hippocampus, and that's one area where our brain can produce neurons. And memories for motor skills, that's our basal nuclei and cerebellum and cerebral cortex. So a lot of these things kind of interconnect between each other. Okay. And brain waves. So we generate millions of nerve impulses. So all of those signals that are being generated in our brain, like right now, just trying to think of all of this, those are our brain waves, right? They're generated by our neurons close to that surface. Many of the neurons can detect those electrodes placed in the forehead and scalp. You can get an EEG, electroencephalogram, to record all those waves. So that's kind of to study normal brain functions and changes that occur during sleep and other brain disorders that you can have. Okay. Whoo. Checkpoint. Throughout the book, also, you have a lot of checkpoints. So I don't know if you've actually spent time reading the book, but it's kind of set up in a really cool way. You got some checkpoints and questions that you can kind of try to ask yourself and see if you can find out the answers to. Clinical connections. There's also Alzheimer's in there. Brainwashing. Okay, so cranial nerves. We're gonna get into the cranial nerves, the different nerves. Okay, we got 12 of them: olfactory, optic, oculomotor, trochlear, trigeminal, abducens, facial, vestibulocochlear, glossopharyngeal, vagus, accessory, and hypoglossal. So we're gonna kind of get into each one a little bit, just kind of where they are, and maybe we can get a function or two of that. So isn't it? This is pretty cool. Like, I'm not gonna lie, this is pretty cool. Like, just how it looks and how you're able to see in a cadaver all these structures. So look how this was cut. Like, you cut through the top and you can see the cerebrum, the top part of the cerebrum, kind of the areas where the cerebral spinal fluid kind of flows through. You're able to see cerebellum, and then you can see all those nerves that go to the rest of our body. So this is a pretty cool picture. Probably one of my favorites so far in this. I'm not having favorite pictures, but just throughout the course, this is a pretty cool picture because it gives you different sections of different areas. So, um, anyways, so yeah, so here we have all our nerves that we're gonna get into. Cranial nerve one, the olfactory nerve has olfactory bulbs, olfactory tracts. Okay, special sensory nerve transmits nerve impulses from the nose, right, to the cerebral cortex related to olfaction, so sensing smell. Okay, so here's our olfactory bulb, olfactory tract. Okay, and here's our olfactory nerve, kind of in between, getting all those signals through. Right. Okay, then we have the optic nerve. So again, go through them yourself. There's a cool. I think there's a table too that has them all. Yes, it is the last one. Table 18.4. But basically, kind of if it's gonna tell you if it's sensory or motor or kind of both, and then kind of their main function. So olfactory was kind of a smell. We have optic chiasma, and optic tracts, so kind of where the information goes through. That's mainly vision. So those are also sensory, right? So we can see through here, kind of looking at that. Then we have oculomotor, trochlear, and abducens. So those are somatic and motor. The trochlear is somatic or motor somatic. The trigeminal, somatic motor. Abducens, motor somatic as well. Movement of the eyeballs. So we have, so one by one, oculomotor, movement of the eyeballs and upper eyelids. Near vision, constriction of the pupil. The trochlear will be movement of eyeballs. Trigeminal, touch, pain, thermal sensations from the scalp, the face, and kind of all these areas. Chewing, controlling the middle ear muscle. Abducens will be movement of the eyeballs as well. So those are kind of all related to the eye, kind of this area, this section, right, of our face. Okay. So again, other clinical connections that you can maybe try to look up and see what they are and how they, why they happen, and you get back to those nerves that we're kind of looking at or learning about. Okay. Then we have the trigeminal nerve, so that's number 5, right? So it's mixed, so it can have sensory and motor. So sensory relates to touch, pain, thermal sensations, and then motor can be chewing and controlling of that middle ear muscle. Okay, then we have our facial nerve, which is number 7. We have sensory and motor information. So we have taste, right? Facial nerve, you have taste, touch, pain, and thermal sensations of the skin. Control muscles of facial expressions. Middle ear muscle, secretion of tears and saliva. That's our facial nerve. Bell's palsy one. Vestibulocochlear nerve, special sensory, so hearing and equilibrium. So its focus is hearing and getting our balance and sending information to our brain. Vertigo, ataxia that we talked about, nystagmus. Glossopharyngeal nerve, number 9. So sensory and motor as well. Sensory is taste from the tongue, swallowing muscles, blood pressure, oxygen, carbon dioxide levels. Motor will be assisting or helping in swallowing, secretion of the saliva. Then we have our vagus nerve, number 10. Sensory can be tasting from the epiglottis, throat and voice box muscles, blood pressure, oxygen as well, CO2 levels, touch and pain, and thermal sensations. The motor would be swallowing or vocalization and coughing. It could be motility of like moving to secrete the digestive canal organs a little bit, constrict respiratory passageways and things like that. Whew. Okay, and number 11, we have the accessory nerve, proprioception and pain from that trapezius and sternocleidomastoid muscle. So kind of like more like in the lower area, kind of in the neck. Um, and motor can be like movement of the head and the pectoral girdle. I need to work out. Yeah. Okay, and then number 12, the hypoglossal nerve. So that's somatic, receiving information, speech, manipulation of food, swallowing as well. Sorry, that's motor. My bad. That's motor. Send information to help with speech, manipulating food, and swallowing our food. Uh, there is a little mnemonic for cranial nerves, so you can memorize them all. So again, try to get as much as you can out of all of these, but it says O to touch and feel very green vegetables. So I guess that's olfactory, optic, oculomotor, trochlear, trigeminal, abducens, facial, vestibular, cochlear, glossopharyngeal, vagus, accessory, hypoglossal. So that's having them in order. So if you remember, if you're able to memorize that, you're lucky we're not testing live, or else you'd have to memorize all of this. But try to get as much information as you can and memorize all this, because you don't have time to research all that during the test. Um, so yeah, we got to page 86. I took away a couple pages, but almost to 90. So okay, the test is ready. The test is posted. I did the test before the video. There's a couple of questions at the end. Make sure you know a little bit about your nerves. Make sure you know your structures. Make sure you know a couple of the functions. A couple of images as well. So just try to get as much as you can out of these last two chapters. So we're ready for a dissection of the brain next week, right? So good luck and see you next week.